Hello.
Hello.
Hey,
Hello.
I always say this on summer meetings. I don't know how well attended this will be. We'll see, I guess. But I always expect it to not be. And I think last time we had just the same amount of people as normal. So we'll give it a few minutes.
Hello, hello.
Hello. We'll wait just a couple, maybe just one more minute since people are still trickling in. But yeah, we might have light attendance again. I I say again because I've mentioned it a few times, although every time I say it, it seems like
It's the summer in Europe, right? Everyone's on vacation already. So
well, that's true, but like I think we've had consistent attendance anyway. I'm always anticipating it's going to be very light, but then it doesn't end up being light. Um,
It's not really the summer in Europe. Like I think it's all gray and bad weather, so not summer at all.
it's like 30 degrees and humid here. It's awful. I can't deal with it.
yeah, it's been brutal in my neck of the woods. The humidity is unbelievable. Okay, I guess we can go and get started. There's just a couple issues on the agenda for myself. Feel free to add something or jump in at the end. Obviously, we'll have some extra time. I wanted to, well, first, I guess we should say if you're interested in introducing yourself, you can raise your hand either physically or digitally, and we'll do an introduction, but there's no pressure if you don't want to. Ivan? Sorry, we can't hear you. It happens. Not yet. Okay, we'll come back to you later, or you can drop a message in chat if you feel like it. Okay.
There we go.
Oh, hey. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, there we go. All right, sorry about that. My name's Ivan or Ivan, either one works. I work in Swisscom in Switzerland, and we are using OpenFeature, integrating it into our feature flag solution that we have, and specifically FlagD. There's some stuff there that I'm interested in about, and I want to join in the meetings and see the roadmap. Just go from there.
Cool. Thanks for coming. I'll put the Google Doc in the chat as well. This has our agenda. Okay, so yeah, I'll get started. There's only two small things I wanted to mention. So first is the tracking discussion. We've been talking about tracking, and I think this discussion highlights a lot of really cool findings. I've really been appreciating it so far. A couple things I wanted to specifically mention here that came out of this discussion and highlight for people, maybe to accelerate your onboarding into the topic. It seems like in the discussion we've kind of elucidated two things that I'd like to kind of hammer out here a little bit and get more feedback on. The first is kind of these special properties. So I like to relate these properties a little bit to the targeting key we have in the context, in the evaluation context in OpenFeature. The whole point of having the specified targeting key in context is so that we can map this like user identifier, this well-known established user identifier in the open source world in OpenFeature, essentially to the user identifiers of the of other SDKs, whatever they might be, because a lot of SDKs have a like canonical user identifier. So that's why we added that to the context. Similarly, I'd say very similarly, there's some canonical properties in a lot of tracking APIs from vendors we're seeing. And a lot of times they're called like metric value or something along those lines. And they're basically, they represent like a numeric value associated with a tracking action. So if you're tracking, dollar spend in a cart, and that's related to a feature flag, and you're doing an experiment with that, you need some number to say like, here's the dollar spend. And I guess that's a common enough use case that, it's kind of a first-class citizen, a lot of SDKs. I hope I'm doing an adequate job explaining that, but that's one of the things that's come out of the discussions that I think we really need to hammer out, because we may want to have kind of a well-defined mapping for this value. Does anybody have any comments on that, or want to say anything about that right now?
I brought it up in the context of Launch Darkly and Split, basically mostly because I just looked it up in their SDKs and they just happened to find it there. Do you know if it's like how prevalent it is beyond those two SDKs? Like, have you seen it in a bunch of other places too?
I think DevCycle has something equivalent to it as well.
Okay.
And the other place I saw a certain equivalent was segments track data structure. They have an equivalent.
Okay.
Yeah, I think most do, because like most things you'd want to be tracking are like numerical things, so you can do averages and comparisons and all that type of stuff, but track like timings of things and things like that. So like having a numerical value is pretty important for those. Not everything is just like this user triggered this button once or whatever type of things.
Cool.
Yeah, and obviously like you could we would support kind of arbitrary payloads, but having this like well-established, canonical value of some kind, I think is important. One of the things I wanted to bring up, I'll share my screen really quickly, so that I can be a tiny bit less vague or abstract. Segments API has actually 3. So they have these reserved properties. One is value, and I think this is an exact equivalent to what we're talking about. But then they also have currency, which is a currency in an ISO 4127 format, and revenue, which is a float. Like the distinction would be like value is kind of, in some implementations, I see value as a number and revenue as a float. Obviously, these two are pretty opinionated, but this is pretty much exactly in line with what we're talking about. An abstract value to associate with the event is typically used in a situation where the event doesn't generate real dollar revenue, but has an intrinsic value, like newsletter signups or whatever. So I think this is kind of exactly what we're talking about. So I think one of the things I'd really like to figure out is if we want to spec something like this. I'm leaning towards yes, and then what we should call it and how we should talk about it, that sort of thing.
So the way Segment does it is kind of the same way as looks like it's kind of similar to the way kind of OpenTelemetry has those kind of semantic conventions where like certain properties have special agreed upon semantics. Would we do it? Have you got like opinions on? I'm sure you've got opinions. What are your opinions on doing it as a kind of a reserved value? Like if you use this property, it should have this semantics versus having a separate kind of argument when you're calling that track function that says like, metric value is a separate argument.
I've considered both. I got to be honest, I don't yet have an opinion. I think it probably needs to be one or the other. Like I don't think none is an acceptable choice. I think we need to do something. I just don't feel strongly yet that I know which of those is the right choice.
Yeah. It feels like there's a spectrum of like opinionatedness from like on the one extreme making it a required value that's a separate kind of parameter and you always have to kind of like pass, and then on the other extreme like not liking it at all and just being like, the community has come up with this convention that you use metric value as a property, but it's not mentioned anywhere in OpenFeature is a spec, and then in the middle there's like, properties where they like in the middle is like the OpenTelemetry thing where they kind of like treat it as almost like a separate standardization process to get those semantic conventions kind of ratified. I kind of like the having it outside of the spec proper because it gives you a little bit more wiggle room to kind of like let the cow paths emerge, like see how people are using it and then say, oh, like we keep on seeing people use this metric value thing, let's actually put it in the spec somewhere as like a recommended kind of semantics for that specific thing.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend it not being a required field because
right, some events don't have
you
dollar values.
The two ways I think about it is like, yeah, you could have the interface be like a user object and then like an event object where you define kind of some of the top level fields, and like there's maybe like the type or the target, whatever you want to name it, is the required field, and then everything else like value and any other fields that you want to add are optional, and then people can also add whatever other custom fields they want to that object. The other approach is you kind of have an interface where it's like you're tracking an event, passing in the user context, and then you set maybe like the required fields in the method parameters. So you have like a type field, which is your main parameter, and then you maybe have two implementations of the track method, one with the value field and one without. And then you could potentially have an optional like metadata like object field as part of those. Is kind of how I think about them, but those are kind of the two main approaches that we thought through ourselves of how to do this. But I don't know what works best here.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think like in my quick survey, I've seen a lot of APIs that do it as a dedicated parameter. And I think it's very easy to deal with those from a provider perspective if you're authoring one, if it's also like a first class parameter in our API. But I also worry about like the impedance mismatch that causes between providers that don't operate that way.
Right. Like targeting key is kind of the equivalent of that, right? Where it's so common and you kind of need it in some SDKs that it made sense for us to kind of elevate it to this special thing that's like a separate parameter. And maybe metric value just about tips over to that, but the other ones don't. I definitely it doesn't feel like we should. I guess like I don't really have a super strong opinion on it. My gut feel is kind of copying what Segment does. Is Segment is close enough to like basically like a standard for kind of this stuff that I would kind of lean towards copying what they do. I guess there's a slightly more general API, like their use case is more general than one, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it deserves a little bit more discussion and I some more thought. So I'm going to try and I'll continue to kind of steward the discussion. I think that my feeling is if we can't really decide, then we should go for a more conservative option. And then because then we can always add things in. It's hard to take things away, right? So we always try a more conservative implementation that we could, whatever implementation we identify, that then could be easily modified. or enhanced if we really, if like you're saying, the cow paths are clear there and we have difficulties of implementation for providers. But I'll like I said, I'll continue to steward that discussion. The second point I wanted to talk about is also mentioned here, mostly by Lucas. I'll give you the TLDR, but the idea is, I do have an opinion on this one, but the idea is like, we know that we're going to have these tracking or these providers that don't support tracking. We know that's going to be a thing. Like Flag D isn't going to support tracking, for instance. It's not its purview. But we know that there's even SDKs that don't have an equivalent feature. So when they don't, users still might want to have tracking. And I think that's one of the things that we actually have a pretty cool opportunity to allow from an open feature perspective, is to allow people to kind of build these mix-ins where they have like, you know, some provider that doesn't support, let's just say Flag D because it doesn't support tracking. They have Flag D as their provider, and then they want to use Segment to track. The thing that the thing that I was proposing was kind of a mix-in, like I said, so maybe even using the multi-provider that was recently implemented by some of the folks from DevCycle, where you could have one provider that does your flags and one that just does tracking. And if you mix them together, you're going to get basically an amalgamation of these two, so you can have the whole solution. The alternative is to have a dedicated tracking provider on the API. So you do OpenFeature.set tracking provider.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Lucas was proposing here, and it was initially one of my thoughts. The reason why I'm a little bit leery about that approach is that it means we have to define or at least implement a whole new life cycle for this provider. And I think it would be much easier to kind of use the same life cycle, right? So if you have this mix-in provider, it's initialized when it's initialized, it's ready when it's ready, it's shut down when it's shut down. There's only one provider state you're really dealing with. It has the same life cycle, and the ability to do tracking is mixed in with the ability to do everything else. If you have a set tracking provider, then you have to, like, when is that guy ready? When can you use it? Is it initialized with the other one? Like, is your client ready when both are ready? In which case, I'm not sure. It means more implementation on the SDK side, whereas the kind of mix-in provider I was describing means more implementation probably in user land. So I'm not sure if I did a great job explaining this, but I'm unsure. I'm leaning towards one solution, but I'm not completely sure. So I don't know if people have takes on that.
I have opinions, but I have been talking a lot, so I'm going to hold my tongue for a little bit.
Not here too much.
Yeah, it kind of
go
feels
ahead.
like to me I don't know. Yeah, I think I need to think about it a bit more deeply. It's hard for me to say at this point. I think my initial thing is maybe it should be a like set as a tracking provider, but yeah, it would be nice to, like, I guess, does that bring up the question for existing providers? Would they need to expose like an existing sort of flag provider and a tracking provider interface? Would you need to set both, or is there a way to like combine them together?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the other question, right? Is my kind of argument to Lucas, which I'm willing to be convinced I'm wrong, is I think the case I'm describing, where people want to like mix in tracking to a provider that doesn't support it, shouldn't be our main goal. I think if you're really interested in tracking, you're probably using a vendor that's doing tracking in their provider. You're probably using DevCycle or LaunchDarkly or something else that has native tracking support. And so prioritizing making that easy, I think, should be our main goal. And if you're trying to do some mix-in thing where you're like, I want to use flag D and segment and whatever, like, okay, sure, we have a solution, but you're gonna have to do some configuration.
I don't know if
Yeah.
that's. I'm not sure I agree with that part. Like, I would almost argue the opposite, that if you've got an existing analytics system set up, there's probably already tracking stuff like shopping cart conversion, right? Like that's pretty important for your business. You've already got it set up. It would probably actually be much nicer if you could just say, okay, like use that thing, and connect it to my feature flagging system, and not having to have two sorts of truth. I mean, that's basically why Segment exists as a hugely successful product, is because there's a bunch of different places where you have to do the same thing because it's going to a bunch of different backends. But I don't think that's. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm sold that people are using feature flagging systems that have this capability because they want to. I think it's because they don't have any choices, because they don't have any choices because there haven't been things like OpenFeature around and make it easy to plug and play different ecosystem things together.
That could be true. You could be right.
I think like I think I lean more towards what Lucas is proposing in terms of like just as a general kind of like software design kind of principle, having small dedicated interfaces that you can kind of compose together generally works out better. And having an interface where, depending on the context, sometimes this method makes sense and sometimes it doesn't, is always kind of like a bit of a challenge, right? Like sometimes you have to do it, but like having a thing where like, oh, don't call this method unless you can't. Basically the type system doesn't tell you all the things you need to know. You also need to have some kind of runtime semantics of like, oh, if it's a non-tracking provider, then there's this method here, but it's not going to work. And it feels like that multi-provider thing is kind of a neat solution if you went down that route, but it's also going to be a huge pain in the butt to implement that. The semantics for that is going to be really weird because you're going to have like, I think it makes it even hard. Like already, I think we struggle a little bit, understandably, to kind of figure out what should all the semantics be for that multi-provider when you've got like two different providers and one of them isn't initialized yet and one of them isn't. And that's because of that type system state thing, right? Where sometimes it makes sense to do this thing and sometimes it doesn't. If you then make that interface kind of like even wider, where now it has like this tracking API on the same interface as well. Now you have to say like, well, in the multi-provider, what if we have two people that implement tracking? Do we have to call both of them? And like, if one of them fails, what do we do? Like all that kind of stuff, you know what I mean? Whereas if you just had like a separate tracking interface, then I think that solves some of the complexity because you don't have to, it's like sliced into smaller pieces, you know?
Yeah, I hear you, Thomas.
Yeah, I was mainly going in the same direction as Pete. I think also what I've saw in a lot of companies is like most of them are more mature in terms of tracking than they are in terms of feature flagging.
Yeah.
So having segment everywhere is kind of a norm in a company, while you can have like multiple feature flagging solution within your company. So trying to say, yeah, we want to take it from the feature flag part. I understand because of open features, but most of the company are taking it the opposite way. It's like, we are doing tracking with segment. How we ensure that our feature flagging working with segment or working with any other tools, but it's more the opposite way than I want my feature flag to track my event too. So that's why I'm more towards leading two separate concepts. I don't know how to frame it in the right way, but I think it's two different concepts from most companies.
Okay, well, great discussion. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion, and I feel like less strong about it after this this conversation. So yeah, maybe put your opinion in the thread. I'll try and follow up with the notes a little bit after this, and link directly to some of these questions.
I do think you're right though, Todd, that like the life cycle thing, having those two separate life cycles does sound like a bit of a headache. But maybe there's a way that we can kind of like take some shortcuts where if there's a provider that if there is a backend that implements both those interfaces, it's a tracking provider and a flag evaluation provider, then we kind of somehow can kind of like you can ride on the coattails of the lifecycle thing that's already there, maybe in some way. I have no like formed solution, but it feels like maybe you can do something.
Yeah, the provider lifecycle is already pretty hard, both in terms of implementation and cognitive load on users. And so I'd like to try not to make those already burdensome things worse.
Yeah.
That's one of my priorities. I guess how we get there, I don't feel strongly about. Yeah, great discussion. Thanks. And then the last one I wanted to mention is already on the agenda too, this issue 256 in the spec. Ryan came up with this, and it goes back to the provider lifecycle, but it's a weird, kind of a weird case where in a lot of cases, your provider emits events when it's ready, but we're also emitting our own ready event automatically from the SDK when the provider is ready. And so it forces you to do some maneuvering to prevent some duplicate events. Yeah, so there's basically a quality of life he's proposing where we might be able to, using some properties or metadata of the provider, kind of declare that we're going to take care of sending the initial ready or error events ourselves from that provider instead of having the SDK do it. So that's a small proposal. It's pretty self-contained, so I'll let people read that and comment as they wish. And I thought it was an interesting idea. I guess I'm seeing a pattern of feeling more conservative myself in a lot of these choices as our spec gets bigger and bigger. But I'm
The gray hair catching up on with you.
Yeah, it really is, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, just something to think about. So take a look at that if you want. I think that's all I had. I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to talk about any other topics, but feel free. It finally was a smaller group today. I think the summer finally caught up with us. Okay, well, I guess that's it. I'll update the notes, and I'll probably post some messages in the Slack channel about some of the stuff we talked about today, just for the people who weren't here. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Ja, das ist, das macht schon was.